I want to tell you about the exact moment an arrogant man cut $30,000 from my salary, looked me dead in the eye, and smiled. It was not a grand theatrical smile. It was the small, quiet, terribly cold smile of a man who firmly believed he held every single card in the deck and that I was completely powerless to do anything but accept my new reality. His name was Julian Cross. He was the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Vertex Solutions, a company where I had dedicated 12 years of my professional life, pouring every ounce of my energy into building their foundational architecture. He was 41 years old, wore custom-tailored suits that probably cost more than some employees made in a month, and possessed the terrifying kind of confidence that only comes from never having actually built anything with your own two hands. He walked into every room as if he had conquered it, expecting immediate and unquestioning submission. I was 48 years old. My name is Evan Vance. On a bleak Tuesday morning in late October, I found myself sitting across from Julian in his expansive, glass-walled corner office on the 6th floor, listening to him dismantle my financial stability with the casual indifference most people reserve for choosing a cup of coffee. The room was stark, deliberately devoid of personality, designed to make anyone sitting on my side of the desk feel incredibly small. He spoke of corporate restructuring and necessary adjustments, stringing together meaningless buzzwords to mask the brutality of his actions. Then came the blow. My base salary, which had been $130,000 a year, was being unilaterally reduced to $100,000, effective at the start of the following month. $30,000 vanished, erased from my life with a simple signature and that quiet, condescending smile. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing the shock register on my face. I had been in the corporate world long enough to know that showing vulnerability to a man like Julian was exactly the kind of validation he was seeking. I simply asked if his decision was final. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and gave me that smile again, suggesting I should be grateful I still had a job at all. I nodded slowly, stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of his office. I did not argue, I did not plead, and I certainly did not explain what that $30,000 meant to my family. What Julian Cross did not know, what he could not have possibly comprehended in his arrogance, was that nestled safely inside the inner pocket of my jacket was a finalized, signed offer letter from Zenith Systems, our biggest direct competitor. The offer was for $180,000 a year, complete with a generous signing bonus, comprehensive equity options, and a senior director title. I had signed it 3 days prior at my kitchen table, with my wife Clara standing right beside me, while Julian sat in his pristine office believing he had just put me in my place. The absolute truth was that my departure was already a guaranteed certainty. He had just handed me the easiest exit strategy of my entire life, completely unaware that the structural foundation of his company was about to walk out the door forever. To fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening, you have to understand the context of my life and my role at Vertex Solutions. I am not a flashy person. I grew up in a quiet, working-class neighborhood where the value of a man was measured by his reliability and the quiet dignity of his labor. My father worked in a steel mill for 35 years, and my mother managed our household with a fierce, uncompromising thriftiness. I learned very early on that the people who make the world function are rarely the ones standing on stage taking the credit. I spent my 20s and 30s mastering complex systems integration, the intricate invisible network of code and logic that allows massive corporate databases to communicate seamlessly. When it works, no one notices. When it fails, entire supply chains grind to a devastating halt. I had joined Vertex Solutions when it was just a struggling startup led by its founder, Richard Thorne. Richard was a pragmatist, a leader who valued substance over style, and he hired me to build their data integration framework from the ground up. I did exactly that. Over 12 years, I became the central nervous system of the company's technical operations. I knew every workaround, every legacy flaw, every specific patch needed to keep our top clients functioning. But more importantly, I had developed a proprietary synchronization protocol outside of work, entirely on my own time and using my own personal equipment, before I even signed my initial employment contract with Richard. My life outside the office was grounded by my family. Clara and I had been married for 22 years. She had recently transitioned to part-time work after a prolonged illness, meaning my income was the primary anchor for our household. Our daughter, Olivia, was 20 years old, halfway through a demanding degree program at a state university, relying entirely on us to cover her tuition and living expenses. We still had a substantial mortgage on our home. When Julian Cross arbitrarily slashed my pay by $30,000, he was not just adjusting a line item on a spreadsheet. He was actively endangering my family's security. He was taking away the financial buffer that allowed us to sleep soundly at night, and he was doing it purely to assert his dominance over the old guard of the company. It was a calculated act of corporate cruelty, but he had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. Because while he thought he was trimming the fat, he was actually severing the only lifeline keeping Vertex Solutions from catastrophic failure. The culture at Vertex Solutions began to rot. The moment Richard Thorne stepped down and the board of directors brought in Julian Cross. Richard had built the company on a foundation of mutual respect and technical excellence. He understood that the real value of a tech firm lies in the quiet, competent individuals who actually write the code and maintain the systems. Julian, on the other hand, was entirely a creature of appearances. He arrived with a fancy degree, a polished vocabulary consisting mostly of meaningless corporate jargon, and a clear mandate to maximize short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. Within his first 2 months, the atmosphere shifted drastically. The seasoned engineers and integration specialists who had built Vertex were marginalized, replaced in leadership meetings by a newly hired cadre of young, aggressive managers who knew everything about crafting a visually appealing presentation but absolutely nothing about the actual technical infrastructure of the company. The most insufferable of these new hires was a man named Simon Cole. Simon was 31 years old, carried himself with an unwarranted swagger, and was appointed as my direct supervisor despite having zero practical experience in large-scale systems integration. It was insulting. Every time Simon asked a basic, fundamental question about our architecture. Questions a first-year junior developer should have known. I had to bite my tongue and patiently explain it to him. Julian constantly praised Simon in company-wide emails, attributing my team's successful deployments entirely to Simon's supposed visionary leadership. It was a systematic erasure of my contributions, a slow and deliberate process of making me invisible while simultaneously relying on me to keep the entire operation running flawlessly. I endured it because of Clara, because of Olivia, and because of a misplaced sense of loyalty to the company I had helped build. But loyalty is a two-way street, and Julian had just driven a bulldozer right down the middle of it. The turning point had come a few weeks before the salary cut, orchestrated by a former colleague named Elena Rojas. Elena had left Vertex Solutions 3 years prior, recognizing early on that the company's trajectory was shifting toward a culture she despised. She was now a senior talent acquisition director at Zenith Systems, our fiercest rival in the logistics software sector. Elena and I had maintained a quiet professional friendship. She knew exactly what I was capable of, and more importantly, she knew the immense value of the proprietary synchronization protocol I possessed. We met for coffee on a rainy Thursday evening. She did not waste time with small talk. She told me Zenith Systems was aggressively expanding their integration division, and they desperately needed someone with my exact skill set. She essentially described my own resume back to me. Over the next 3 weeks, I went through a series of intense, highly technical interviews with Zenith's senior leadership. They did not ask me about my leadership philosophy or my 5-year vision. They asked me how to solve complex real-world data bottlenecks. I answered flawlessly, drawing on 12 years of hard-earned experience. The result was the offer letter I now carried in my pocket. $180,000 a year, a position of genuine authority. A company that actually valued technical expertise over empty charisma. It felt like breathing clean air after being trapped in a suffocating room. But the true weapon I held was not just my expertise. It was a matter of strict federal law. Years ago, before I ever walked through the doors of Vertex Solutions, I had spent countless nights and weekends developing a unique algorithmic framework for data synchronization. I wrote every line of code on my personal laptop, sitting at my kitchen table, entirely uncompensated. This framework eventually became the hidden core of Vertex's most critical client deployments, specifically for massive accounts like Oakhaven Logistics. However, because I created it prior to my employment and never formally transferred the rights, I retained full ownership of it under federal copyright law, specifically Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. Vertex was essentially using my intellectual property under an informal, undocumented, implied license that existed solely because I was an employee. If I left, that implied license vanished. I had brought this up casually to Richard Thorne years ago, and he had simply trusted me to keep using it for the company's benefit without demanding ownership. Julian Cross had no idea this arrangement existed. He assumed, as all arrogant executives do, that the company owned everything its employees had ever touched. He had no understanding of the intricate legal landmines buried deep within the company's legacy systems. When Julian smiled at me and announced my $30,000 pay cut, he thought he was exerting leverage. He thought he was forcing a subordinate into line. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was actively driving away the sole legal owner of the only piece of software that allowed his company to process its largest logistical contracts. The sheer hubris of his assumption was breathtaking. He believed he was the master of the chessboard, while I was simply removing the board entirely. I walked out of that office knowing that my revenge would not require shouting or sabotage or malice. It would only require my absence and the cold, unyielding weight of the law. The 2 weeks following my resignation were a masterclass in corporate panic disguised as procedural transition. I submitted my official notice exactly 1 hour after Julian cut my salary. I kept the email completely professional, brief, and devoid of any emotional language. I simply stated that I was resigning my position. My last day would be in 14 days, and I would spend the remaining time ensuring a smooth handover of my active projects. I copied Julian, Human Resources, and my incompetent supervisor, Simon Cole. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere in my section of the office shifted from stagnant to frantic. Julian did not reply to the email directly, but Simon was suddenly hovering around my desk constantly. He tried to project an air of unbothered control, but the nervous tension in his posture betrayed him. He started demanding detailed documentation for the Oakhaven Logistics account, specifically asking for the source code repositories for their primary data bridge. I complied fully with his requests. I directed him to the exact servers and the precise folders where the operational documentation lived. I did not hide anything. I did not delete a single file. I simply provided exactly what was asked of me, nothing more and nothing less. What Simon failed to realize, because he lacked the fundamental technical comprehension to understand the architecture, was that the documentation only explained how the system operated on the surface. It did not contain the proprietary underlying framework I had written years ago, the framework I legally owned. That code remained securely on my personal encrypted drives, untouched by Vertex's internal network. As the days ticked by, the reality of my departure began to sink into the broader team. A seasoned developer named Daniel Brooks, who had worked alongside me for 8 years, approached me quietly in the break room. He looked exhausted, carrying the preemptive weight of the chaos he knew was coming. He asked me if the systems were going to hold up after I left. I looked him in the eye and told him honestly that the systems would function exactly as they were legally permitted to function. He frowned, not fully understanding the legal distinction, but he knew me well enough to recognize that a storm was brewing. The situation escalated dramatically on my second-to-last day, when a shocking discovery transformed my quiet exit into a severe legal confrontation. The Human Resources Director requested a brief exit interview. It was mostly standard procedure, returning my keycard, signing off on final payroll details, but then she slid a thick folder across the desk. It was my personnel file. She mentioned a standard intellectual property assignment agreement that all employees supposedly signed upon hiring, confirming that Vertex owned everything created during my tenure. I frowned, knowing full well that Richard Thorne, had specifically exempted my pre-existing synchronization framework from any such agreement. I opened the file and found a document dated 3 months prior, supposedly signed by me, retroactively assigning all rights of any software I utilized at Vertex to the company. My blood ran completely cold. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked vaguely like mine, but the loops were wrong, and the pressure was inconsistent. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never signed it. It was a blatant forgery. I asked the HR director where this document originated. She casually mentioned that Julian Cross had personally submitted it to my file a few weeks ago as part of a compliance audit. A profound, terrifying realization washed over me. Julian had known, or at the very least, he had suspected that my integration framework was a vulnerability, and he had taken criminal steps to cover it up before cutting my salary. Forging a signature on a legal document to steal intellectual property is not just a fireable offense. It is a severe crime. Under the California Penal Code, Section 470, forgery with the intent to defraud is a felony. That forged document was legally void ab initio, void from the very beginning. It had zero legal standing, but its existence proved a level of malicious intent that completely changed the dynamic of my departure. I did not raise an alarm. I did not confront the HR director. I simply asked for a photocopy of my entire file for my personal records, a request she granted without suspicion. I walked back to my desk, holding the undeniable proof of Julian Cross's desperation and criminality. The $30,000 pay cut was no longer just an insult. It was part of a coordinated effort to subjugate me and steal the foundation of my life's work. My plan for a quiet exit evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated determination to ensure that Julian faced the absolute maximum consequences for his actions. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Clara and explained the forgery. She was horrified, but then her expression hardened into the kind of fierce resolve that had always anchored our marriage. We immediately contacted a specialized employment and intellectual property attorney she knew through a former colleague. The attorney reviewed the forged document and the original copyright registration for my framework. His reaction was a mixture of disbelief and predatory anticipation. He explained that by forging the document, Julian had effectively handed us a nuclear option. Not only could we enforce the copyright under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, but the forgery opened the company up to massive punitive damages and potential criminal investigation. We drafted a devastating cease and desist letter, scheduled to be delivered to Vertex Solutions exactly 48 hours after my final day. I returned to the office for my last day with a sense of total serenity. I packed my meager belongings, shook hands with Daniel Brooks, and walked out the door without looking back. Julian was nowhere to be seen. He was likely hiding in his office, completely unaware that he had just signed his own professional death warrant. The weekend following my departure was unnervingly quiet. I spent it mostly with Clara and Olivia, enjoying the profound relief of knowing I would never have to step foot inside Vertex Solutions again. On Monday morning, I started my new role at Zenith Systems. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. My new office was bright and functional. My team was comprised of sharp, competent professionals, and my base salary of $180,000 was a constant, reassuring reality. Elena Rojas had not exaggerated. Zenith was a company that operated on respect and capability, a stark departure from the toxic environment Julian Cross had cultivated. But while my new life was beginning smoothly, a catastrophe of monumental proportions was unfolding across town. At precisely 9 a.m. on Tuesday, our attorney's courier delivered a thick, legally binding package directly to the executive suite of Vertex Solutions, addressed to both Julian Cross and the board of directors. Simultaneously, the automated licensing mechanism built deep into my proprietary synchronization framework. The framework running the massive Oakhaven Logistics account reached its designated expiration parameter. I had designed the framework years ago with a continuous authorization loop. It required my specific cryptographic key to renew its operational cycle every 30 days. I had manually renewed it every month for 12 years. I was no longer there to renew it. At exactly 9:15, the primary data bridge between Oakhaven Logistics and Vertex Solutions severed completely. Massive streams of supply chain data, inventory manifests, and shipping schedules instantly halted. The Vertex servers began throwing catastrophic failure alerts. Simon Cole, hopelessly out of his depth, scrambled to diagnose the issue. He dug into the repositories I had left, searching frantically for a solution, but the core architecture was utterly opaque to him. The system was completely locked out. Panic erupted on the floor. Oakhaven Logistics, furious at the sudden disruption, immediately escalated the issue to Julian's desk. As Julian was absorbing the reality of a total system failure on their most critical account, the courier package landed in front of him. The contents were devastating. It was a formal demand letter citing Title 17 of the United States Code. Section 106, explicitly stating that Vertex Solutions was currently operating unlicensed, proprietary software owned solely by Evan Vance. It demanded the immediate cessation of all use of the framework. But the second part of the package was the true executioner's blow. It contained a forensic analysis of the intellectual property assignment document, highlighting the forged signature and explicitly referencing the California Penal Code, Section 470 regarding forgery. The letter informed them that we were prepared to file a massive civil lawsuit for copyright infringement and fraud, and that we would gladly present the forged document to the district attorney for criminal prosecution if a settlement was not reached immediately. I received the first frantic voicemail from Julian at 10:30 that morning. His voice, normally so smooth and commanding, was strained and breathless. He begged me to call him back, babbling about a misunderstanding, insisting that we could work out a new arrangement, perhaps a consulting contract at double my previous rate. I did not respond. 30 minutes later, a second voicemail arrived. This time, the arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. He pleaded with me to restore the Oakhaven connection, claiming the company would face ruin if the client terminated their contract. I listened to his desperate voice while sitting in my new spacious office at Zensis Systems, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hard sense of justice. The reality of his actions was finally crashing down upon him. He had cut $30,000 from my salary with a smirk, believing I was a disposable asset. He had forged my signature, believing he was untouchable. Now, he was begging the man he had tried to humiliate to save his career. The board of directors, however, did not wait for Julian to fix his mess. Once they were made aware of the catastrophic system failure and the impending legal nuclear strike involving a forged document, they convened an emergency session. The legal exposure was beyond catastrophic. Not only were they facing massive damages for copyright infringement, but the revelation that their CEO had committed felony forgery to secure intellectual property threatened to destroy the company's reputation entirely. Our attorney received a call from Vertex Corporate Counsel that afternoon. They were terrified. They requested an immediate confidential mediation session to resolve the intellectual property dispute and avoid criminal escalation. They were completely capitulating, throwing Julian Cross to the wolves in a desperate attempt to save the company from complete annihilation. My departure had not just created a gap, it had exposed a rot so deep it threatened the entire structure, and all it took to trigger the collapse was a single, arrogant decision to cut my pay by $30,000. The final act of Julian Cross's disastrous tenure at Vertex Solutions was characterized by a chaotic, desperate flailing that only accelerated his downfall. As the reality of the legal threat and the catastrophic system failure settled in, Julian made one last, incredibly stupid decision in an attempt to salvage the company's rapidly plummeting financials. Realizing that the settlement for my intellectual property was going to cost the company millions, and terrified of the board's impending wrath, he hastily attempted to execute a massive reduction in force. Without consulting the legal department or proper executive channels, he ordered the immediate termination of nearly 200 employees across multiple divisions, hoping the sudden drop in payroll would offset the massive financial liabilities he had just created. It was a move born of pure panic, and it ignored a fundamental piece of federal labor law, the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the Warren Act. The Warren Act explicitly requires employers with 100 or more employees to provide at least 60 days advance written notice of a mass layoff affecting 50 or more employees at a single site of employment. Julian, in his arrogant desperation, provided 0 days of notice. He simply locked them out of the building and sent automated termination emails. The backlash was instantaneous and explosive. The terminated employees, many of whom had been loyal to Vertex for years, immediately mobilized. Within 48 hours, a massive class action lawsuit was filed against Vertex Solutions for blatant violations of the Warren Act. This, on top of the impending copyright infringement and forgery litigation from my attorney, created an absolute legal nightmare that the company could not possibly survive intact. The board of directors convened a final, brutal meeting on a Friday afternoon. Julian Cross was summoned and summarily terminated for cause. His pristine suits and arrogant smile were powerless against the sheer volume of catastrophic liability he had generated in less than a month. He was escorted out of the building by corporate security, clutching a small cardboard box of his belongings, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his authority. The company itself was forced to issue a groveling public apology, reinstate the wrongfully terminated employees with back pay to comply with the Warren Act, and agree to a massive, confidential financial settlement regarding my intellectual property. A settlement that dwarfed my previous salary and the pathetic $30,000 he had tried to steal from me. Furthermore, our attorney ensured that the evidence of the forged signature was retained, hanging over Julian like a permanent shadow, effectively ending any chance he had of securing another executive position in the industry. As for me, my life moved forward with a profound sense of peace. Clara's health continued to improve, and the immense stress that had hovered over our finances completely evaporated. With my new salary of $180,000 at Zenith Systems, combined with the substantial settlement from Vertex, Olivia's tuition was paid in full, and our mortgage was eliminated entirely. I settled into my role at Zenith, surrounded by a team that valued hard work, technical brilliance, and fundamental respect. Elena Rojas and I often shared a quiet cup of coffee in the mornings, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of how rapidly an arrogant man could destroy his own empire. The entire ordeal left me with a deep, uncompromising understanding of professional worth and the dangerous illusion of corporate loyalty. For 12 years, I had allowed myself to believe that quiet competence and dedication would eventually be recognized and protected. I had allowed myself to become indispensable yet invisible, a crucial pillar holding up a structure that felt no obligation to support me in return. Julian Cross's smile on that cold October morning was the most valuable gift he could have ever given me. It shattered the illusion completely. It showed me exactly what the system thought of me: a line item to be reduced, a resource to be exploited, an obstacle to be managed. When a person or an organization shows you that they hold you in contempt, the only correct response is to believe them immediately and take decisive action. Power in the professional world does not always look like loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, true power is simply the ability to recognize your own undeniable value, secure a better alternative, and quietly walk out the door, taking your essential contributions with you. I did not destroy Julian Cross. I simply removed the foundation he was standing on and allowed the weight of his own arrogance, incompetence, and criminality to pull him down. He cut $30,000 from my life to prove a point, and in doing so, he lost his job, his reputation, and the company he was supposed to lead. I am 48 years old. My name is Evan Vance, and I have never slept better in my entire life.